word for it. The Intelligence and Security Committee report on China, a very long-awaited report, took ages to get this thing out, concluded that that Beijing had penetrated every sector of the United Kingdom economy. And the principal vehicle for that was United Front work, so this overseas influence operation of the Chinese Communist Party. So this is a really widespread problem and something that we've lacked the tools to deal with.
Now, though, the House of Commons Speaker, Sir Lindsay Hoyle, has told The Times that Chinese spies have been given a licence to operate in Parliament. This was his reaction to the decision to drop charges against two men, one a former parliamentary researcher, who were charged last April under the Official Secrets Act with passing information to an enemy. However, that case was dropped, you might recall, because prosecutors said there wasn't enough evidence. So Lindsay Hoyle says in a letter to the new Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood that he fears that decision leaves the door open to foreign agents trying to spy on MPs in the Commons. And he says he's also considering taking the dramatic step of bringing a private prosecution against those two men. Well, Luke de Pulford is the co-founder of the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China. Good afternoon, Luke.
Good afternoon.
What did you make of Sir Lindsay's letter today?
Well, it's absolutely extraordinary. I can't think of any precedent for it. I think it's important to say at the outset that these two men have not been tried and found guilty. We've got to keep that in mind when talking about this. But last week, the Speaker came to the House of Commons, expressed his frustration at that outcome, and so did the government, and so did every member of Parliament who spoke. And I really can't think of a comparable situation where charges are dropped and that happens. I think for him to take the step of considering a private prosecution is without precedent and shows how seriously he's taking this.
With your work, what do you think the scale is of interference from the Chinese in our government?
Well, I wouldn't restrict it just to our government. It's a problem that affects every area of life in the United Kingdom. And don't take my word for it. The Intelligence and Security Committee report on China, a very long-awaited report, took ages to get this thing out, concluded that that Beijing had penetrated every sector of the United Kingdom economy. And the principal vehicle for that was United Front work, so this overseas influence operation of the Chinese Communist Party. So this is a really widespread problem and something that we've lacked the tools to deal with. Actually, the complaint in the Speaker of the House of Commons' letter and what the Director of Public Prosecutions have said about this is basically we didn't really have the tools to deal with this until the National Security Act was passed. It seems as if the reason that they weren't able to meet the evidentiary threshold for this case was to do with actually being able to label China as an enemy for the purposes of that legislation. That seems to be where this has fallen down. And the Speaker is saying...
I mean, because as you say, both men in this case say they were innocent. Their lawyers say they never should have been charged. Just leaving aside those two men who were accused in this instance, what do you think would be a good change in Parliament to stop the sort of thing they were alleged to have done? Because if another suspect one day was found guilty of this sort of offence, what difference would you like to see happen?
Well, the current security minister said that he didn't think that we would suffer from this problem again in the future because we now have the National Security Act, which doesn't require an enemy state to be defined. It has very broad offences to deal with influence and interference operations in it. So arguably we're already there in terms of the legislation. The frustration, I think, among the people who are speaking out right now, and certainly the Speaker, is that can't be used in this case. So that's really why you're seeing the reaction that you are. But in addition to having the right tools to enable the intelligence and security services to be able to address interference, we also need a much more realistic posture when it comes to dealing with China more broadly. There doesn't seem to be enough of a realization within government that Beijing under Xi Jinping right now is an adversary to the United Kingdom. It means to try to influence and interfere in our system. And we have to have that front and centre if we're going to have a realistic posture towards China.
But they also want partnership in business, don't they? So there's a realpolitik too, isn't there? We've seen the government bending over backwards to accommodate the Americans on their state visit this week. And in a sense, that same logic applies. Whatever you think of their leadership, they're a superpower. You don't want to put up barriers to British business achieving success via China.
Yeah, but at what cost? I mean, I think I would say simply to you, I don't think we should trade away national security. And I think most people would agree on that. So, regardless of however much the government thinks that we might be able to get China to rescue our economy, it isn't worth the price of our national security. It isn't worth lowering the drawbridge to the extent that we can't actually deal with interference in our system.
What's the situation here with TikTok, by the way, and how much of a problem is that when it comes to Chinese interference? We follow what happens in the States, where Trump was looking for a US buyer, and he says there's now one that's been found, but he won't say who yet. He's pushed the deadline again, hasn't he? But in the UK, that conversation's kind of dead.
Yeah, it's weird. It has come to a bit of a standstill. The problem with TikTok was, I think, consistently misunderstood. As far as we were concerned, the issue was data transfer and the risk that personal data could potentially be transferred to a jurisdiction where it wasn't safe, or at least it was accessible to the Chinese government. That was the problem with TikTok. And we were trying to argue that actually people's user data shouldn't be flying into a jurisdiction where it can be used by the government. So that was the argument. Unfortunately, it never really got off the ground in the UK. What we had is a slightly half-assed attempt to prevent certain government officials using it, and that's where it stopped. But actually, the risk is much broader than that. It's not just a risk to government officials, it's a risk to everybody who's using the app.
What's the intel that you think China most prizes then? You know, if you take the view as you did, they're an adversary, they want to use our data. What are they going to do with it?
Our personal user data, well, there are any number of things in any number of sectors. Let's take the example of genomics, for example. One minister a few years ago said on the floor of the House, and had to retract it, that there had been weekly hacks upon British genomics by Beijing genomics. Why would they want that data, and what could they use with it? Well, if the Chinese government can analyse genomic data, they can derive all kinds of strategic advantages when it comes to medical development, but also understanding perhaps the susceptibilities of populations that live in the United Kingdom, all sorts of things that can be useful to the government of China. Personal data shouldn't be flying about to jurisdictions where you can't enforce your data rights. If somebody takes your data in China and the Chinese government uses it, there is nothing you can do about it. It's not like you can make a court complaint and get a fine. There's nothing you can do. And it does hand a country which I believe to be an adversary of the United Kingdom a lot of information which can advantage them and give them unfair advantage when it comes to competition, but also unfair strategic advantage when it comes to broader geopolitical questions.
Okay, Luke de Pulford, co-founder of the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China. Thanks for joining us.